They say love changes with time, but I never imagined that the man who once held my hand through every storm would one day let it go as if it never meant anything. You know, sometimes the quietest heartbreaks don't come from strangers. They come from the people who once promised you forever. Soft pause. Hi, I'm Aisha, and this is my story. Before I begin, if you've ever loved someone so deeply that their silence hurt more than their words, then stay with me till the end. And if this story touches your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because some stories are not just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. Soft breath. When I met him, I was 23. He was 26, confident, charming, and full of dreams. We met in the most ordinary way, through a mutual friend at a wedding. But you know how some people walk into your life, and everything suddenly feels like it was leading to that moment? That's how it was with him. His name was Omar. We didn't fall in love dramatically. It was quiet, gentle, and real. He wasn't the kind of man who used big words or made grand promises. He was simple. He smiled with his eyes, and that smile made me feel safe. We got married a year later. Nothing fancy, just family, laughter, and two hearts promising forever. And for a while, forever actually felt possible. The early years were beautiful. We built a small home filled with big dreams. I still remember the way he'd bring me tea every morning before going to work. How he'd whisper "take care" like it was his prayer for the day. He used to say I was his peace, and I believed him. But peace, it doesn't last forever, does it? Somewhere between bills, children, responsibilities, and exhaustion, we forgot to look at each other the way we once did. Love didn't vanish overnight. It just faded, quietly. Omar started spending more time at work. At first, I thought it was normal. That's what good husbands do, right? They work hard for their family. But soon, even when he was home, it felt like he wasn't really there. He'd scroll through his phone while I spoke. He'd nod without listening. He'd eat without noticing I'd made his favorite dish. And then came the worst kind of silence. The one that fills a room even when two people are sitting just inches apart. I'd lie beside him at night, staring at the ceiling, remembering the days when he'd pull me close before sleeping. Now, he turned the other way, and I told myself it was just stress, that it would pass. But deep down, I knew something had changed. 20 years. 20 years of marriage, of giving, compromising, forgiving, and yet I had become invisible to the man I once called my home. It's strange how love can turn into habit, and habit into indifference. One evening, while cleaning his study, I found a receipt, dinner for two, at a fancy restaurant we hadn't visited in years. My hands shook. I stared at the date. It was last weekend, the weekend he said he was working late. I told myself not to overthink, that maybe it was a work dinner. But a woman knows. Our hearts, they always know before our minds accept it. That night, he came home late, smelling of expensive perfume I didn't own. He kissed our daughter goodnight, but didn't look at me once. And I realized he was slowly unloving me in ways words could never describe. For weeks, I carried that silence like a wound I couldn't show anyone. I smiled at breakfast, cooked dinner, folded his shirts, packed his lunch, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was breaking quietly. One day, I gathered the courage to ask. I stood by the window, the evening light falling softly across our living room, and I asked, Omar, are you happy with me? He didn't answer. He just sighed, and that sigh said everything. He looked at me, almost pityingly, and said, "You've changed, Aisha. You're not the same woman I fell in love with." His words hit harder than any betrayal. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. In his eyes, yes, I had changed. I was no longer the girl who laughed too easily or dreamed too loudly. I had become a woman who carried everyone's needs except her own. And maybe that was my mistake. I forgot myself somewhere between being a wife, a mother, a homemaker. After that day, he became colder. He'd leave early, come home late, barely speak. I didn't need proof anymore. I knew he had someone else. And worse, I knew he didn't even feel guilty about it. One night, after everyone was asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at our old photo album. There we were, younger, lighter, glowing with dreams. I traced my finger over our wedding photo, and tears blurred the image. I whispered to myself, where did we go wrong? But the truth was, I already knew. Love had stopped being a choice for him. But pain had become mine. Still, I didn't confront him. I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted to remember what dignity looked like. Because sometimes silence is not surrender. It's self-respect. He thought my silence meant acceptance. But really, it was the calm before the storm of my awakening. Over the next few months, something inside me began to shift. I started spending time with myself again. Reading, painting, going for walks. It was strange, learning who I was outside of him. And with every small act of self-love, the noise of my heartbreak grew quieter. He barely noticed. Because when someone stops seeing your worth, they only see your absence once you're gone. But I was still there, building my strength in the shadows. And deep down, I knew one day he would look for me again. Not because he loved me, but because regret always finds its way home. Soft exhale, but that part of the story, the day he finally realized my worth, that came later, much later. And when it did, it was too late, because by then, I had already found myself. I used to believe that pain had a voice, that it screamed, begged, and cried for attention. But the truth is, real pain doesn't make noise. It sits quietly inside you, twisting everything you are, until one day, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. After that night, when I saw him with her, something inside me died, but something else, something stronger, was born too. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the empty side where he used to sleep. The smell of his perfume still lingered in the air, and I hated that I still loved it. My heart felt like it had been hollowed out, yet I was still breathing, still pretending, still existing. For weeks, I stayed silent. He didn't even notice the change in me. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care enough to ask Dot every morning. He'd leave with his phone glued to his hand, smiling, typing, lost in a world that didn't include me anymore. I'd make breakfast like I always did, hoping, foolishly, that one day, he'd look at me the way he used to. But that day never came. Instead, he started staying out late. Work meetings, he said. But I knew the truth. And worse than the betrayal was the humiliation, the way I was shrinking every day, quietly fading into the background of my own life. One afternoon, while cleaning the study, I found a message on his laptop. It wasn't just casual talk. It was intimate, tender. Words he hadn't said to me in years. Words he once used to make me feel like the luckiest woman alive. I didn't cry. Not this time. I just closed the laptop, walked into the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw me. Not a wife, not a mother, not the woman who cooked and waited. Just me, and she looked tired, broken. But there was still a faint spark in her eyes, a spark that said, "You've survived worse. You'll survive this too." That day, I decided something. I wouldn't beg for his love anymore. I wouldn't fight for a place in a story that didn't value me. I started small, updating my old resume, signing up for an online course I had once dreamed about but never had time for. At first, it felt silly, like I was pretending to be someone I used to be. But slowly, that pretense turned into purpose. He noticed, of course. "Why are you so busy these days?" he asked one night, irritation in his voice. I smiled. "Just doing something for myself." He laughed, the kind of laugh that drips with mockery. "At your age, you think it matters now?" That one sentence cut deeper than any betrayal ever could. But it also lit a fire in me I didn't know I still had. I started waking up earlier, journaling, reading again, reclaiming pieces of myself I'd lost somewhere in the years of being his wife. And as I began to change, I noticed something strange. He started to change too. He grew restless, uncomfortable, unsure of how to deal with a version of me that didn't revolve around him anymore. He'd make sarcastic comments, question my choices, remind me how good I had it. But inside, I was quietly building a new world, a life that didn't depend on his validation. There were nights I cried silently, still fighting the ghosts of love that lingered in the corners of our home. But every tear washed away a little more weakness. And every morning, I woke up a little stronger. Months passed. One evening, he came home early, unannounced. I was sitting in the living room, editing a presentation for a new job I had just landed. He looked around, confused. "You're working?" I looked up, smiled softly. "Yes, I got hired last week." For a moment, he just stood there, like he couldn't process what he was seeing. Then he said, "You didn't even tell me." I replied gently, "You never asked." That silence between us was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. It was the sound of realization, his, not mine. For years, I had begged to be seen. Now, I didn't need his eyes anymore. He started noticing things. How I smiled more often, how I hummed while cooking, how I dressed differently. But it wasn't for him anymore. It was for me. He'd ask me to sit with him, talk, spend time. But by then, the distance had become a wall he could no longer climb. The more I found myself, the more he lost me. One night, he tried to reach for my hand, the same hand he had once taken for granted. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold back either. And that hesitation, that quiet pause, told him everything he needed to know. He looked at me with eyes full of confusion, maybe even fear. He was finally realizing that I was slipping away, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had finally remembered my worth. He said softly, "You've changed." And I smiled. No, I just stopped forgetting who I am. As I lay in bed that night, I didn't feel anger anymore, just peace. The kind that comes when you stop chasing love that was never meant to stay. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. They say time changes everything, but sometimes it doesn't change what happened. It just changes you. Months turned into a year, and by then, I had rebuilt a life that didn't need him to exist. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not to him, not to anyone. I was just living. I'd wake up to my own peace, not to the sound of his indifference. The mornings were quieter, but they were mine. My job had started growing into something beautiful. I met new people, learned new things, started traveling again. Every version of me that he had ignored, I was now meeting for the first time. But the strange thing about finding peace is that it often brings back the people who once destroyed it. It was a rainy Thursday evening when I saw his name flash on my phone screen. After all this time, I stared at it for a long moment, not with excitement, not with pain, but with an odd calm. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, another message appeared. I just wanted to talk. Please, for years. I had begged for his attention. Now, he was begging for my time. I remember smiling softly, not out of pride, but out of understanding, because I finally saw what I couldn't see before. He never left because I wasn't enough. He left because he didn't know how to value something real. A week later, he showed up at my doorstep. The same man who had once walked out so easily now stood there, hesitant, older, smaller somehow. His voice trembled when he said, "You look different." I smiled gently. "No, I just look like myself again." He looked around the house, the new furniture, the fresh flowers, the warmth that didn't include him anymore. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. And I replied, "Everything that reminded me of what I lost." We sat down, and for the first time, I wasn't nervous. He was. He tried to explain, to justify, to say that he made mistakes, that the woman he left me for wasn't what he thought she'd be. I listened, calmly, because I had learned that not everyone needs words. Some just need closure. He said, "I thought you'd always be here." And I said, "That was your mistake." There was silence, the kind that comes when a person finally realizes what they've destroyed. He told me he missed me, my cooking, my laughter, the way I used to wait for him at the door. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I didn't wait for anyone now. He reached for my hand, the same hand that once trembled for his touch. But this time, it stayed still. I looked him in the eyes and said softly, "You had me when I loved you the most, and you lost me when I finally learned to love myself." He lowered his head, and for the first time, I saw regret, real regret, sitting heavy in his eyes. But regret doesn't erase years of silence. It doesn't rebuild what you broke out of pride. I wished him peace, genuinely, because I had already found mine. After he left, I sat by the window. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled clean, like something had finally been washed away. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "I forgive you, not for him, but for me, for the woman who once thought love meant staying quiet through the storm." I learned that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's strength, the kind that rebuilds you from the inside. People often ask me if I ever took revenge, and I tell them, yes, I did, but not through anger, not through bitterness. My revenge was peace. My revenge was becoming everything he thought I couldn't be without him. I traveled to the places we once planned to visit. I danced again. I laughed again. I started writing again. And somewhere along that journey, I realized I didn't need closure from him because I had already given it to myself. One evening, months later, I received a message from him, a single line that said, "You were right. I didn't know your worth until it was too late." I didn't reply because sometimes silence is the loudest answer. I looked out the window, the sunset spilling gold across the sky. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost, but what I had found. And in that golden silence, I whispered, "I'm finally free."